let's talk about the sustainable growth rate. This is a very important tool when assessing the financial health of a company because basically it's determines, it gives you an indication of how much growth the company can sustain with basically its own profitability, right? So it's a growth in earnings, right? But many times we also use that as the growth in sales, right? Because if you assume that the same cost structure remains, then one approximation is to say, okay, this is also a measure of how much I can grow in sales. Um, so the growth in sales that can be sustained by maintaining the same capital structure and without having to add any additional equity. So think of yourselves as the owners of a company. You're saying, okay, how much can the company grow without me having to put more money of my own? The only money that I'm allowed to put under this sustainable growth rate concept is just any profits that I generate through my operations. I can plow them back into the company, right? I can actually reinvest them, retain those earnings and reinvest them into the company. And if I do that, I can borrow a little bit more because I have a new equity coming into the company. But basically, I am not adding fresh funds, only the funds that I'm generating through my own profitability. So again, think of a sustainable growth rate as a rate at which you can grow your sales, for example, without you having to put any additional funds as an equity holder. Okay, all the funding, the new funding that comes in, will only come in through uh, retained earnings and any additional um, borrowing you will make because you have new equity in the company. So G star, which is the sustainable growth rate, is the formula itself is called, it's basically a function of the retention rate times the ROE. The ROE we've already seen as a measure of how much profitability we're generating on behalf of our uh, shareholders, or the owners of the company. The retention rate is how much money we retain out of our profitability. So think of it this way. Retention rate is basically 1 minus the dividend payout ratio. This is called dividend payout ratio. Okay. So if our net income is of 100 and dividends are 5, then the payout ratio in my example will be 5%, right? 5%. Okay. If the payout ratio is 5%, what is the retention rate? Well, 5% is the amount, the portion of net income that we're paying out as dividend. That's why it's called the dividend payout ratio. So 5% of our net income is being paid in dividends. Therefore, how much are we retaining? Well, 1 minus that would be, in this case, 95%. Okay. So the retention rate is 95%. The payout ratio is 5%. So G star, the sustainable growth rate, says, okay, how much you can grow is going to be a function of first how much you can retain, okay, times what you are able to do with that money. If you retain a certain amount of money, right, as equity, right, because when you retain earnings, is as the equity holders are plowing back money into the company. If you retain those funds and those funds can grow at the ROE, right? That tells you how much, what is the growth rate of the equity that has been invested into the company. If you multiply those two, that will tell you basically how much you can grow in sales. Okay, so if you have, let's say, 100% retention rate, right? Suppose to make it easy, so you put all the money, all your retained earnings, you reinvest it in your company. This is very typical of younger companies, right? So if you have 100% retention rate, then a G star will be basically a function of what? Of your ROE. So if your ROE is, say, of 5%, 10%, 20%, then your sustainable growth rate will be exactly that ROE. Only if you have a retention rate of 100%. So 100%, right, or 1 multiplied times your ROE, that will give you your sustainable growth rate. In my example, if your ROE is 20%, 20% times 1 is 20%. That is your G star. Okay. If your retention rate is not 100%, but say 95% or 85%, then you, instead of 1, you're going to have to multiply this times, say, 0.95 times your 20%. And so your sustainable growth rate will be slightly lower. Okay. Now I want to explain a little bit, the confusion here. People generally understand that the more money you put back into the company, the more the growth that you can achieve because you're putting back money so that you invest in assets and allow growth to occur. Okay. What people tend to not understand very intuitively, right? The intuition is not very clear, is why ROE is such an important component of how much the company can grow. So for that, I have a few slides that I want to explain. So let's suppose that your optimal uh, capital structure, right, is 30%. Okay, what does that mean? So D over V, just in accounting terms, just to remind you, right, the the value of all the assets, the book value of all the assets in the company, is really the sum of debt and equity, right? So this D over V is like saying this D over D plus E, right? And if it's 30%, what does that mean? Remember, this is a measure of leverage, correct? So what does that mean? It means that out of every dollar that you raised, okay, and that you will be raising, how much will come from debt? 30% of that. So 30 cents of a dollar will come from debt. How much will come from equity? 70 cents of a dollar. Okay. And when we call this our optimal capital structure, all we're saying is that this is the perfect debt, this is the optimal, right, mix of debt and equity, such that if we borrow at this ratio, then our cost of funding will be as small as possible. Remember from the very first video that I showed you that the lower the cost of capital, the lower the WACC, then the higher the firm value, the higher the intrinsic value. So if for us, we want to find that right mix of debt and equity so that our cost of funding is as small as possible so that the firm value can be enhanced.